Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. So here we are. We're still calling this Arnhem Week, but actually we're going back to earlier than that. So the creation of the First Allied Airborne Army in August 44, farcical or fabulous? Lewis Brereton, brilliant or blundering? Did it impact Market Garden? These are the questions we are asking our three wise men, Jeff McGovern, Mike Peters, and James Daly. I'll bring them in now. Good afternoon, evening, gents. How are you today?
All good. Yourself?
So let's start off with the creation of this army. I mean, the British, the Americans, we go from, dozens of paratroopers in 1939-40 to enough to equip an army, one of the largest formations kind of fielded in warfare. That's quite a massive leap in 4 years. But James, you're the one who's done the work on all the cancelled operations. So you've been looking at all that paperwork going back and forth. What's your take on the reasons behind the creation of this army and its, at the same time, its pros and its cons?
So, I mean, I found there was a lot of pressure coming from Washington, from Marshall and Arnold, who were very keen on large-scale airborne operations and were putting a lot of pressure on Eisenhower in particular to bring airborne to a theatre level, whereas for D-Day it was happening almost on a national army group level. They were pressing Eisenhower from May, even before D-Day, to make it a theatre level operation. And of course Eisenhower is very much a Marshall protege, and I think he accedes to it shortly after D-Day. So although First Allied Airborne Army is formed in early August, the wheels really start turning in late May, early June.
Okay, thank you. And so Jeff, we'll bring you in kind of representing the Air Force. I mean, 44 is the era of big everything. It's the era of AGRAs in Royal Artillery. It's massive, great fleets in the Pacific. It's kind of, as James Holland talks about, that big war aspect. The toolbox that was a little bit empty back in 41, 42 is kind of brimming with tools now. And now is the big question of how to deploy them. So, you've been a paratrooper and you looked at it from the Air Force point of view. So I'm guessing you're kind of split a little bit about the creation of the First Allied Airborne Army. It's a good thing, it's a bad thing. Start us off with your initial thoughts.
I think it was a fabulous experiment. It's the sheer size of force, right? You've got a strategic tool, a new strategic tool that can shorten the war. That's the goal. And it's an idea to try. I think it got a little bit too big for its britches. And it's a planning. I think it's also I think the commander thought it would be an operational headquarters when it's really a planning headquarters. If you look at the first line in their mandate, it's to plan and then train and not necessarily execute an operation. So I think when people think of it as an operational army, it's a mistake. It was an experimental command and control, operational planning kind of thing.
And Mike, we'll bring you in, and you've looked at things from the glider pilot point of view. You've been doing your 8th and 9th Air Force. The bigger the tool, the longer it takes to kind of get into action. And that's one of the things that, as James can elaborate on, has been elaborating on, is that so many of these airborne operations, by the time they've kind of reached execution stage, the need for them has passed. So, getting a company of commandos ready for a lightning raid doesn't take very long. Getting an army ready takes a lot longer. So what's your initial thought about the creation and the pros and cons of it?
I think it makes a lot of sense on paper, and as Jeff just said, and you just mentioned as well, as a planning headquarters. In fact, we look at the British situation, the Army Air Corps, SAS, Parachute Regiment, glider pilot, all together. It's an administrative headquarters, and it's that mission creep we'll get into later with Browning trying to take it in, make it an operational headquarters that where things start to come arrive. But for me, as a resource control organization, as a standardization of training, as correlation of assets and resources, that it makes a huge amount of sense. And also, I think one thing that we should really all think about is when we get into this discussion is people are already looking beyond the war, and airborne forces is seen as this great tool of the future still, even though the Germans are coming hard the other way, saying, don't go there. This doesn't work anymore. But we're going, the Allies, we've invested all this time, all this resource into it, and bigger is better. So, let's do this. Let's have an allied army, airborne army that does all these things and rationalizes all these things. I think that, so to me, in principle, it's a good idea.
Thank you. And Andreas just said in the chat there about, was there a chance the British parachute units were disbanded to fill up the infantry? And that's essentially what the Germans are doing and have been the last year and a half of the war, is just using these well-trained troops to fill in the role on the ground. I mean, that's a rabbit hole that we probably haven't got time to go.
I think what Andres is referring to there is when the infantry crisis of 1943, where the Brits are running out of bayonets, people to fight. So, is there a chance, inverted commas? Yes. Realistic chance? Probably not. No, because you need that fire brigade, you need that Allied Airborne Army to go wherever and do whatever you wanted to do. So
we're going to kind of move in towards Brereton and the creation of the army, and we have to look at where he's been before. And the most recent appointment is 9th Air Force, although he's been around the houses, I guess we'd say. So Jeff, as the Air Force guy from the American point of view, give us a kind of a thumbnail sketch of Brereton and where he's been, and because he's not been someone who's been in the headlines, shall we say, through the war. He's been there, but it's kind of not on the slide lines, but
depends on what headlines. Yeah, because he ends up going to the Philippines about a couple of weeks, 4 weeks maybe before the Japanese attack, and so he's in charge of the Army Air Forces there in the Philippines. Very short-lived command. He gets to Australia, then he's the deputy commander of ABDA. He's involved with sort of trying to counter the Japanese movement into Southeast Asia. That fails. Then he goes to China, to India, and tries to establish the 10th Air Force. And then, because the Army Air Forces at that time is so short of resources overseas, he's tasked to move his airplanes to North Africa, where he hooks up with Halpro and their B-24s. He's in charge of the Middle Eastern Air Force, and then which redesignates him to the 9th Air Force in North Africa. So he works with Western Desert Air Force, and then through into Tunisia. And then at the end of 43, he's offered the new job of the new 9th Air Force commander in the UK, and he takes that. And then he runs with 9th Air Force. Now, I think, as we'll talk about probably about what is his style of leadership, he's a showman. He likes his drink. He likes his women. And if he's got good subordinates, which he normally does, whether he chose them or not, and the subordinates do a really good job, he lets them run wild or run free. So Quesada in 9th TAC and 19th TAC, Williams with 19th Troop Carrier. You make him look good, he'll back you. And I think that, and he likes the PR piece of it. And so he runs, and then we'll talk about in a minute, how does he get to FAA in a minute. So he's at 9th Air Force, the largest Air Force in the European theater. I think it had 4,100 aircraft, 180,000 airmen in it. Yeah, so he's got a big job, but it's primarily executed through his subordinates, right? Through the 9th TACS, 9th Air Service Command, and those other ones.
And Mike, we'll bring you in now, because but the 9th Air Force, as Jeff said, they're great subordinates there, but maybe the 9th Air Force, those branches of fighters and bombers and troop carriers, they're not acting entirely independently, but they have their own kind of jobs that are sort of distinct. Whereas with airborne, everything has to connect, doesn't it? Troop carriers, getting the guys in the air, paratroopers, gliders, and that's a different prospect. It's very much a combined arms approach. So what Mike, if you were looking to appoint a commander of the First Allied Airborne Army, what kind of person would you be looking for? What would be the requirements for this relatively new warfare?
Well, you need an Air Force Eisenhower. It does not necessarily have to be. You need somebody who's good with people, who's going to cross those borders and break down those tribal barriers, and not get into that tribalism. And that's what. So I think someone with those qualities. And when I was thinking about this program, I went through Brereton's CV. I'm sure we all did, and I was thinking of it from an ex-military man. I was looking at his career profile. He starts off with Billy Mitchell, and he's coming through, and he's in at the start of it all. He's in the Signal Corps. He's in the infancy of the Army Air Corps, then the Army Air Force. He's in amongst the big movers and shakers and that. So he's known, and I think this is what we're going to touch on, because he stays out of trouble. He's a good ideas man, and as Jeff just alluded to, patronage is there. If someone's good, he's going to which is what he should do. He's a senior leader. You pick up somebody who's a junior leader, so give them all the resource they need, and you encourage them, and you support them. I think where Brereton becomes a bit unstuck is what was just touched on there about his personal qualities. He likes his drink, he likes his women, he's been divorced, his personal life, he takes a few setbacks career-wise. So, hey, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think if you look at, you mentioned it in your introduction, how do you go from a embryonic airborne force, or even an embryonic air force, which the American Air Force is before World War II, and then just grow? How do you grow an air force? How do you grow an airborne force? And where do you find the people to manage and run that? And if you just keep your nose clean, which Brereton does, then you're going to go somewhere. But what I think is interesting, the number of times he moves, how he gets moved around a lot. So that says to me, from my experience of life in the military, that maybe wasn't that good. He's like, he's not being moved on because he's good. It's like, yeah, we need to move you on and get someone else in here to do this. That's my between the line view of him. But has he got the qualities? Probably he has. And we'll get into that with Mark again when he lets Browning gives Browning all that leash. Good decision or bad decision, all that. But yeah, I think that's true.
Okay, James, I want to bring you in again because of all of us here, you've done the most at studying the operations that didn't happen, because most of us here, we're judging the prowess and efficiency and success by the operations that did happen. But as you have found out, you can find out a lot about the ones that didn't happen. So, in all those papers and you've been through, as the Normandy jump was successful, and then there was all these plans, some of which got close to happening, some of which didn't get close to happening. What do you see as what is needed to kind of the Normandy jumps from an airborne point of view were pretty good. Okay, missed drops, but most of the missions were accomplished. What do you see? What does the paperwork tell you that this structure needs to make it better?
Yeah, so I mean, Normandy's an interesting comparison because the airborne drops there are planned in almost a conventional manner. So Gale at 6th Airborne Division works to Crocker at 1 Corps. Browning only has a watching administrative brief over 6th Airborne Division, and that works very well. But I think the difficulty there is D-Day is such a set-piece operation where they've got time. It's a very defined role. They're able to rehearse. Once after D-Day, you've got a much more fluid situation.
Yeah.
And that's more difficult to plan for, obviously. And Browning in particular, and obviously on a national level, you've got Browning who, although he's not the Corps commander at this point, he's HQ Airborne Troops. He asks his staff to refer to him as Corps commander early on. I've never found any authorization for that. He just does it. And the Americans don't have a Corps level equivalent. So Browning sort of steps into the void, quite into the gap. And he always seems to micromanage 1st Airborne Division a lot more than he did 6th Airborne Division. Whether that's because Urquhart's quite new, or whether that's because to Airborne, or whether that's because he used to command 1st Airborne. So Browning does step into the planning quite early after D-Day. So Browning's very much leading a lot of this planning. But I think, again, that alludes to what a complex situation this is, where you've got Browning at one point who's not a Corps commander, but is. You don't have an American equivalent till Ridgway gets the jump up. And then Brereton comes into this. Browning's obviously not happy about being passed over. So it's quite a complex
I think there's a lot of that going on there. There's a lot of that happening, like Chatterton calling himself Colonel Glider Pilots, Commander Glider Pilots. There's no such title. He just invents it. And I think maybe part of that as well, James, is the operational cycle. He's focusing on the division that's due to go next, who's next in line to do something. So that's probably why he's leaning, as it happens nowadays as well. It's just, whoever's next up is the focus.
Let's bring up the organisation of the ETO, because I think it's a pertinent thing to bring up and just discuss that. And Jeff, you put these slides together, so we'll let you kind of explain it there, because there are, as I said, there are some very, very large formations in the ETO by the summer of 44 that we know from the ground. We talked about fillets last week. Monty and Bradley are not always completely in sync with their vision of things. Kind of give us a breakdown of where the FAA fits into the overall scheme.
This is a chart about the 1st of September for the European Theater of Operations. Eisenhower's taken over as the senior ground commander in that week, and Monty's now relegated to only being the 21st only. That's a still a very big job. 21st Army Group Commander. And so ETO's got the 12th Army Group Commander, or it was another name, Central Group of Armies, and then the Northern Group of Armies, which was the 21st Army Group. Another Army group's going to come in a little later. And then he's got his naval and his air forces. And then in this, I've got the strategic air forces, or the way they wrote this chart, way over on my right side as I'm looking at it, although they didn't really belong to Eisenhower, right? They belonged to Portal and the Combined Chiefs of Staff, and then they could be used for various things. And then over on the left-hand side, you've got this new tool, the First Allied Airborne Army. And what is Airborne's role? It starts out in the beginning, right, as small scale, and as it grows larger and larger, as we had said earlier, James and the others, it's a theater tool, right? Can you change the outcome of a theater? So it's a theater strategic tool for the theater's commander to use, and trying to do it in a big picture way to in this case end the war sooner in the European theater. So it's directly reports to SHAFE, and then it's mandated and with various jobs. It's given command, or it's given administrative control and then limited operational control over 9th Troop Carrier Command, 1st British Airborne Corps with their forces, what stands up in August, the 18th Airborne Corps with their U.S. Airborne forces, and when requested and granted, they get the British air transport forces with it. And their mandate is to basically to train, plan, supply, and as I think Mike said, to coordinate, right? So you come up with common ways of operation so that you can conduct an operation very quickly and everybody understands what everybody else is going to be doing with it. And so it's a very sizable theater force, and it's a lot of well-trained men and expensive equipment, right? And do you go through the war without using those coins in your pocket, to use that phrase, or do you try to get them into the game to show their value? And so in September, August, September, when it stood up, you've got this very big tool for Eisenhower to use. And by this time, and Bradley's not interested in it. He's more interested in using the airplanes for supplies. Montgomery is interested in it. And if you look through the list of most of the operations fall of 44, spring of 45 or for 21st Army Group or SHAFE, and only a few for 12th Army Group.
That makes sense. So James, again, let's talk about the requirements again, because as you were talking on World War II Divvy a few weeks ago, you've got to get this balance right with airborne forces between giving them something that needs to be done to make a difference on the battlefield, take advantage of the situation that's changing all the time. But then that comes with the burden of the fact that by the time, again, you've got the unit ready to go in, the situation on the ground has changed. So how do you think Eisenhower, he's not a real, he is a fan of airborne troops, but he can't possibly have the kind of hands-on knowledge of airborne forces because he's got so many things he's having to manage and cover, and there's only so many reports he can read that goes across his desk each day. So again, I think we talked about earlier what is needed for an airborne force, be it a division or an army. I mean, speed, I suppose, of being able to mount it is that key?
Yeah, I think speed. I think there's that airborne paradox about it's got to be something that's worth doing, which inherently means it's got to have an element of risk, but also it's got to be something that's not so risky that you risk losing them. So, and actually the window between those two is actually quite narrow. The other thing you've got lots of commanders who, and not many people actually have a huge amount of airborne experience at this point. It's quite, I suppose you could almost compare it to tanks in 1918. A few people have done some of it, but it's still being developed on the job in a lot of ways. And the other thing that strikes me, and it's been alluded to already, is coordination. You've got to coordinate ground forces with airborne forces, with the troop carriers, all of the different elements of air forces. These are extraordinarily complicated air support plans. Some of these operations involve coordinating with the Navy when in Normandy, or when you get to infatuate at Walcheren. So it's a huge amount of coordination, and I think you probably need a diplomat. As Mike said, you need an Eisenhower type person who's able to get people working together and build relationships. I think that's probably key in all of this.
Let's bring Mike in about, because you said it there, James, about there's people get accused of, oh, well, he's not proper airborne. That's the thing thrown at Urquhart all the time. Well, he's not got any airborne experience. But some ways you could argue that once you've been deployed, once you've hit the ground, the airborne bit kind of has gone out of the window, isn't it? You're just a ground soldier, whether you're glider borne or parachute borne. So, Mike, in the summer of 44, what would make a good airborne commander? What do you think are the principles you would need? Or does it depend on the operation of sending them in to lead?
Well, it's a twofold thing. And you just touched on all I was going to say anyway, from my own experiences. It's just a method of getting there. And Eisenhower would probably have looked at it and say, okay, that's what First Allied Airborne Army is for, is to make sure they get there. That the transport is there, the resources there, the coordination is there. They're on the ground. Once they're on the ground, they're committed. They are sexy infantry, basically, and they're more capable, but I still have to resupply them. And I think, to take James's point a bit further, it's like about tanks. It's also a little bit like naval power in the First World War, fleet in being. Having an airborne force that's not yet committed is a threat. And once you've committed, the enemy knows where it is, and it's pinned down, it's surrounded. So that's an important factor in that. So a fleet in being. So I think, and also the other thing we shouldn't forget is we're talking about this in terms of an army that fights as an army. You can break this army up into chunks and use it in smaller pieces if you want to, in divisions or whatever. That's the beauty of having an Allied airborne army or an airborne corps. You can break it into component parts and use it for different tasks and missions. Or you can go for the big one. You can go for Berlin or whatever you're going to go, whatever they think, or perhaps it's going to be, at the end of the war, and you want to grab something right at the end. So, but it's that we use that. It's been used. The coins in pockets phrase has been used, so I'm going to go with it as well. It's once you've committed it, once you've used it, it's done. It's on the ground and it's committed. There's a reconstitution of that and recovery of that is a whole separate thing. So you've got to be very, very careful when you do use it and how you use it and what you use it for. As is seen it by example, and as you said, I think earlier, Paul, we're pretty new at this. Forget freshmen. I'm talking about the ETO now, not Pacific, but Sicily, Normandy, Dragoon, Varsity. That's it. Arnhem, obviously, but I'm not going obviously, but that's it. The learning curve is huge. So you probably want to conglomerate, to go back to our argument, why have an Allied Airborne Army? You probably do want to put as many brains in one place as you can and coordinate it to make sure it does work.
I can imagine, that Brereton receives the welcome pack. Congratulations on assuming the command of the new Allied Airborne Army. And he says, but all the pages are blank. Yes, we haven't filled it in yet. You're writing the doctrine when you get that an army has not been deployed yet as an airborne army. They have been deployed as divisions at their biggest as part of much more complicated
and everybody has a different idea of how to use it.
Yeah. So
I think
we kind of touched on personalities earlier, and that comes down to it a lot, and the working relationship, if there was one, for example, between Brereton and Browning, with so much time is spent about, I don't know, Nimitz and MacArthur and Patton and Montgomery. But if we're looking at airborne and the deployment as it gets to Mahi Garden, Browning and Brereton are two of the figures involved. Monty is also there, but how you said earlier on, all of you, that kind of Brereton is maybe not, he hasn't got the Eisenhower skills perhaps. What has he got? What we've kind of half covered that, but you're suggesting Brereton for this job. What would you say about him, Jeff?
What would I say? I think before I get to the Browning piece, Browning's kind of stuck. Ridgway is the 18th Airborne Commander who reports to Brereton. Browning is the 1st Airborne Commander who reports to Brereton. Oh, and by the way, he's the Deputy Commander of First AAA, even though he may have wanted to be the senior leader. So he's got two sort of hats that he has to balance. And how do you balance those roles when he's got a direct line to Montgomery, when Montgomery doesn't talk to Brereton kind of as the FAA. So back to, I think Brereton, he wasn't the first choice, right? And I don't know if we're going to talk about that a little bit earlier. Who do you choose? We talked about who do you choose to lead the First Allied Airborne Army?
Yeah.
It's going to be an air guy. and why an air guy? So I'm an ex-ground guy who's now an air guy, and I lead battle staff rides with military units, and I take air and ground guys on these things, and we get into this discussion like, the ground knows the best, and no, air knows the best, and what tool and who commands it. I think it's an air guy. They decide on an air guy because up until the drop or the landing of the gliders, it's really an air operation. And then even we touched on, they land, and now it's a ground fighting thing, but until the ground forces link up, it's still an air operation because resupply is an air thing, right? And then even though there's ground fighting going on, and then once they link up, it's a different ballpark. But so I forget where I was going with that. So Brereton needs to be an air guy, and so they're looking for a commander. Brereton's not first on the list, and I don't know if James, you want to talk about that, or it's a different commander, but there's politics that get in the way, right?
Well, James, let's bring that in there. Bring in the politics as well.
Yeah, so I found some memos going back and forth between Arnold in Washington, Beadle-Smith and Spatz in Europe about who would be the most suitable commander for this. And I think there's not really a firm idea about what sort of background. They agree on a US Air Force general, but there's not really a firm idea about who, because obviously this sort of job's never been done before. So they go through Cannon, who was at the Mediterranean Tactical Air Force, Vandenberg, the Deputy Commander of Allied Expeditionary Air Forces, Kepner, 8th Air Force Fighter Command, and George, the Commanding General of the US Air Transport Command. And for various reasons, none of those were available. They didn't feel they could let them go from their current post or whatever. And Brereton's not even on that initial list. So he's eventually informed by Spatz that he's going to get the job on the 17th of July. So it's interesting again to think the person that gets the job is at least fifth choice, possibly lowest. And sorry to interject along that discussion. You got to bring in General Marshall because they wanted Vandenberg, like you had said. He's a major general, and Browning is a lieutenant general. How do you have an Air Force major general take command over a lieutenant general? So they want to promote Vandenberg. Marshall is he holds his stars very close to his chest and says, "I'm not promoting Vandenberg." And then you go to that fifth choice, right? Who has 3 stars, who can lead this thing? Right?
So, I mean, we had a question earlier about Kevin Getz, Mr. Horse Glider. Did Brereton make any efforts to understand the needs and uses of the First Allied Airborne Army? It seems a little harsh, but I kind of pretty much agree with it on levels there, because even if you Google Brereton, it comes up aviator. He's unashamedly an aviator. He's unashamedly kind of Air Force first. We'll get into that later on. It's when we get to Market Garden, it's about preventing aircraft being shot down by flak. It's all about the efficiency of the troop carriers. Does he really ever attempt to kind of understand the needs of the airborne role? And if so, who would give that to him? I mean, Browning is there, Gale is there. Gale's got a lot of experience. There are people around who've given him that. Does he go into it with this, hey lads, I'm new to this, what does airborne do? Or does he go in kind of having his own firm ideas? Who wants to take that one?
Can I challenge you there?
Yeah.
Experience. You said a lot of experience there. When you say a lot of experience with these guys, I mean, okay, they might have done 1 or 2 operational jumps, but have they done a complete? Most of it is peacetime training, as in exercises back in UK, etc. We are still coming the other way from the embryonic days of airborne forces and learning as we go. So when we say that these people have a lot of experience, and I was going to make this point earlier about Browning, the perception of Browning being the godfather, the architect of British airborne forces and revered by US and Anglo planners. Yes, okay, he has probably got the most experience, but relatively, how much experience is that compared to what we're being asked to do? Every time we're being asked to do Sicily, Normandy, Market, each is graduating in difficulty and complexity each time. Each thing is new. So I do question when we say experience, it's relatively speaking compared to the people around them.
Yeah, the right experience. Yeah, does anyone want to add to that?
Who? Yeah,
so any of you, either James or Jeff, add to that?
But in the Army Air Forces, during the war we divide our sort of force structure into strategic and tactical. And 8th and 15th in the European theater are the strategic big bombers. bombing, impact to inside Germany and other places, manufacture, destroy infrastructure, impact civilian population. Tactical is to support the ground armies. And Brereton in North Africa is with Western Desert Air Force. He's supporting Montgomery's 8th Army as it moves across. And into the UK, he's supporting 12th Army, first US Army, then 12th Army Group with tactical air, of which one of those elements is 9th Troop Carrier Command. And as when we discussed market, it's not just the dropping of the troopers and the gliders, landing of the gliders. There's a whole air support piece about interacting and connecting with the ground armies. And you have to know how to talk ground, and ground has to be able to talk to somebody in air so they can communicate back and forth with one another. So Brereton is not a paratrooper. He's not a gliderman, but he is a tactical Air Force commander. So he understands where those two, or at least he's supposed to understand. Bradley would disagree with that, where they're supposed to link together. So that's key to making an airborne operation happen. From my perspective,
I don't know what James thinks, but I agree. I think it has to be an Air Force commander to just, because otherwise you just don't get there. It's simple as,
I think so, and I think that's where most of the complexity is, isn't it? About when they're scaling up these operations, that's where the complications are in the air plan.
Yeah. No, I mean we'll obviously get to the air plan and Market Garden and how much Brereton's appointment affects the air plan, and obviously we're going to some extent get into kind of speculation, because we can't now to talk about what would have happened if the First Allied Airborne Army wasn't created, because it was created, and so that's what happened. And as you said there, James, earlier, its inception was kind of back in the spring, creation in August. So there's a good, even after creation, there's a good 7 weeks before Market Garden happened. So let's look at this. Are we all basically agreement that the creation of the First Allied Airborne Army wasn't a bad thing? It wasn't a bad idea out of the box. It has merit. It all comes down to commanders' use. And are we kind of in agreement about that? We can't find any reasons not to create it.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, we're just for the benefit of moving on. So we're doing, as I said earlier, we're forming AGRAs for artillery. We're forming this. It makes sense to put them under some kind of heading. Now, as you said, Mike, that doesn't mean you have to deploy them, and that way they can break down to their component parts. But that relies on cooperation and people in charge of these component parts understanding, getting on with the other parts, the other component parts. So, simple question, James. You've done a lot of work in this. How much time did these people actually get to spend time with each other and have meetings and sit down at a table and talk about airborne? So when we're talking about, I'll bring up Jeff's chart again there. Creation on the beginning of August. So how much time was there for these guys to just actually sit around and give each other PowerPoint presentations about what the hell an airborne army is?
Well, not a huge amount at all, because it takes time to generate a headquarters. It takes time to get them up to establishment. It takes time for them to even agree what the establishment of an airborne army should be, because no one's ever formed one before. Lots of the people, so Transfigure, the planning for that starts in August. So already there's an operation kind of underway. So Browning and his staff are involved in that. And say whatever we want about Browning, his diary in July, August, September is pretty punishing in terms of flying from Britain to France to wherever. So you've got headquarters on the continent in England. You've got different headquarters all over England. You've got people trying to plan strategically and operations. So it's quite obviously quite a difficult time. So even the 1st Airborne Division, they don't get a huge amount of time to actually do anything together because they're so scattered and they're trying to plan operations rather than train. I think that's a good analogy for it. That and as you said, Woody, 6 weeks from the army forming to Market Garden, you've got Transfigure, Linnet 2, Comet. That when you divide 6 weeks by that, there's a lot happening in a short space of time.
I mean, that's a very good point, and and there's some of the First Allied Airborne Army plans there. No, that's only the ones after the creation. There are these other ones that you've talked about, James. That has to be a distraction, doesn't it? All these operations of different sizes that get proposed and then not happen and proposed, and in the staff officers, planners, intelligence officers, map makers. They're getting all their resources and their ducks in a row for something that never happens. That if they had just been told, right, we're creating in August, we're definitely not going to use you till September. We're not going to use you. That's it. You've got 4 or 5 weeks to get ready, like kind of pre-season training in football, so to speak. Would that have benefited things, do you think, all of you?
I think it would have. It was never going to happen, though.
Yeah,
and all the evidence I found when I was doing my research, certainly the manifest for the aircraft, it's the same manifest for each aircraft, just a different operational name scrubbed across the top. Scrub one out, put cross out limit, put comet, whatever. And that's what brings the rigidity of planning. There's no scope to maneuver. So that's why you get all the problems you get on Market Garden with the order of arrival and all that, because nothing ever changes. It's like, no, you can't change. You fly from that airfield on that in that chalk, and that's the order of arrival you get. So there is no breathing space. And the answer to your question, yes, it would have been really good, and yes, it would have helped a lot. And we could go down that whole rabbit hole of why First Airborne was the state it was, and 6th Airborne was the state it was, the way they trained and all of that, and the same with the US Airborne Forces as well.
But is that the First Allied Airborne? Because Brereton, he takes command. You read his stuff. He says, "My job is to predict operations, watch the battlefield unfold, and then suggest airborne operations. Then take suggestions from the Army groups, and it sounds and then pass from an outline plan onto the tactical phase, and all that tactical phase. That's 9th Troop Carrier Command, 38th Group, 46th Group, 18th Airborne Corps, 1st Airborne Corps. That's where all that sort of the nuts and bolts happen. Whereas FAA, I think from Brereton's perspective, was let's figure out how I can make this this unit useful and to be executed. And then as the commander, I'll get the glory of putting FAA in the fight versus the detailed planning, which he then passes off to whoever his subordinate, like I think Market in the very beginning on the 10th, he says, Williams is the Air Task Force Commander and Browning is the Ground Task Force Commander. Go to planning, guys. And here's the in essence, what I want you to do. And so in that place, when it comes to execution, I think the FAA does what it's supposed to do. But as we had suggested, everything's happening so fast. How do you train up? How do you coordinate? How do you make sure everybody's on the same sheet of music?
But I think this is what the FAA is meant to do, because it's inside the planning cycle. So, whereas in the early airborne operations, you would have had air transport assets being allocated and learning about the plan on the hoof and trying to understand what they're supposed to do. Whereas FAA would be, okay, we've got these standardized procedures, the way we do business, and Williams and people like that would be inside that loop. So, we know there's going to be an operation here. So we need to pull those assets from flying supplies or medevac or whatever they're doing, get them on the ground, get them serviced, get them all online, ready to do the operation, to anticipate that.
Notice we're 37 minutes in, and no one has mentioned Montgomery, or if they did, it came in kind of tangentially there. Whenever we get to Market Garden, of course, how can you discuss it without discussing Montgomery? And one of the things that's been happening in all the comments on the shows I've been doing about Arnhem is people saying different things about Montgomery's plan. It is his plan. It isn't his plan. It's comment but then Brereton changes it. James, and then all of you, have we got a clear paper trail to precisely show us exactly where Montgomery fits into all this, or is it open a little bit to interpretation of memoirs?
Yeah, I think it's open to interpretation. I think there are differing accounts about the meetings on the 10th of September when Comet's cancelled and Market Gardens launched. There's differing accounts as to whether it's Montgomery's idea or Dempsey's idea. I think, the benefit with hindsight here, obviously with Market Garden, there's differing extents to which people want to claim credit for things that went right or didn't go right, obviously. And again, memoirs, human memory is fallible. So, you do find contrast sometimes, but it is a fairly complex picture. And I think partly the way Montgomery operated, where so little of his orders were written down, and even when they were written down, they were very broad brush. So his directives are very broad, talking about cracking about and things like that. It is quite hard to really pin that down, particularly around that period on the 10th of September.
Yeah. And Jeff, I'll let you respond, because we had a comment from Terry Down. Monty was not above the 1st Airborne Army. Is that right? But beside it in a chain of command with Ike on top of both. Is that a good summary?
I would say they are both direct reporting units to Schaeff. So they both reported to Eisenhower. And so in that sense, they're equals in an organizational structure. And then again, the first AAA is the tool that the Army groups will use or will not use, right? And so they go to, I think, as the 10th of September meeting, and Monty says, well, I want to expand Comet. And Ike says, okay, well, I'll give you access to the full FAAA for this period of time. Okay.
And Mike, your feelings about Montgomery generally, about this? Generally, good pun there.
Generally speaking.
Marshally.
I would defend Montgomery to a point. He's a strategic plan. Obviously, I'm going to drag you back to Sicily again because.
Yeah, I knew you were going to do that. I had it on my bingo, Mike Peters bingo card here.
So Montgomery, when he plans his use of airborne forces in Sicily, he goes straight to his senior airborne advisor, Boy Browning, who comes up with Ladbroke, Glutton, and Fustian, a series of bridges to be seized by airborne operations to be relieved by armoured column heading south to north over a similar distance. And he leaves all that to Browning and then to Hopkinson with the results that we know about. And he does the same again for Market Garden and for Normandy. Now, Montgomery doesn't get a slating for his decision of how to use airborne forces in Normandy, does he?
No.
He doesn't. And he does what he leaves it to his subject matter experts. He gives them the resources and he takes their advice. My view of it's a massively complex subject, and I know this is Arnhem week, but the person who should have advised Montgomery or Brereton has to carry the can for part of it. His name is above the door, but Browning is the architect of the plan, and as are the divisional commanders who are in there saying, "Yeah, we can do this." And there's that great interview with Urquhart after the battle. And he said, "We'd have gone anyway. We were that desperate to go." He says it himself. And that's it. So I think Montgomery gets a lot of hard time, unnecessary flack. He is, pardon the pun, he is the guy.
We're on fantastic form today. I'm enjoying it.
Yeah. He is the guy who reduces the bridgehead for Normandy. He is the guy who makes sense of that and uses airborne forces correctly in the overlord plan. He looks at the plan at the time of Comet, the week leading up to Comet. That's a perfectly sensible plan. That's a gamble. You spoke about the gamble earlier. If you're teaching military doctrine, you talk about the definition of risk or gamble. There's a subtle difference between the two. And you use airborne forces. There is always going to be risk. What you don't want is gamble. So discuss.
Kudos. I would say. Sorry, kudos to Montgomery for the suggestion, right? And based on risk assessment, they just went 240 miles in 6 days. Right?
Yeah.
And so obviously there's intelligence bubbling up that the battle front line is changing and all that. But he does a very uncharacteristic. Well, he does an unusual plan. Yes, thank you. He does a very unusual suggestion with this. Okay, let's go. And now there's the political reasons, post-war, all that kind of stuff with it. But he takes the First Allied Airborne Army, this tool in the theater, and says, let's try it. Based on what I think is what he just went through at the end of August, rolling so quickly against what he was perceiving. And I think there's victory fever in the higher headquarters. We can do this.
I mean, we are going to talk about the number of gliders that First Allied Airborne Headquarters takes into Nijmegen, aren't we? We are going to.
We had that question earlier about gliders and Browning's staff and headquarters. That's come up several times as sidebar. We can do it now or later as you wish.
Well, I just think it exemplifies what we're talking about. Where this is an admin headquarters. It's not meant to deploy, and Browning drags it into the field. It's not meant to go. I think you've got the jeeps to do it, all that stuff. And we lose half a battalion's worth of lift for the market phase, for the Arnhem phase of the operation, and that just shows to me the mission creep. And that war's over by Christmas, and we've got to get airborne forces. And there is James has probably got some stuff on this. There's definitely a what do we do to maintain the longevity of airborne forces after World War II. And this is the new Excalibur. We need to keep it sharp. We need to keep it in place. There's all of that. So there's an agenda about airborne forces that's going on as well. I don't know what you know about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some agendas going on. I mean, people thinking about post-war careers individually. I mean, I guess that's human nature in a way. I think the other thing about Browning and the gliders for Market is that he was going to do the same thing for Comet. So Comet was going to be, the 1st Airborne Division and the Polish Brigade landing essentially as individual brigades at Graf, Nijmegen and Arnhem. Not only was Urquhart's headquarters going to land, Browning's Corps headquarters was going to land as part of Comet as well. Now, it's difficult to know. I mean, Urquhart's headquarters would have been relatively cut off from those brigades. So what Browning's headquarters would have done as part of Comet is really hard to see. But I think that puts shines a bit of light on the decision for Market as well.
And looking at the plans that, as you have done, James, all of you, the creation of the army, do you see a kind of a revolution in how plans are put together after it, or is it evolution? I mean, are things suddenly different in the paperwork? Does it look immediately? I mean, Mike, we've all mentioned the things that, well, you just mentioned yourself, James, about the carryover from the Comet plan, and Mike did as well. What implications does it kind of have in that sense? Is it, as I say, is it instant, or is it a sort of a creep?
I don't know about the British military, but in the U.S. military, we have a hard time fighting joint, which is the air and the ground and the Navy. This is one of those times where it was a forced opportunity to put the air and the ground at the same table, speak to one another, develop the TTPs. The military does, is a modern term there. And then when the war ends, it's gone, and then we have to relearn again and again. So the opportunity. I think there was an opportunity there and it was used temporarily, but the war is over very quickly. And then that jointness and then combinedness, with the Brits and the Poles and the French, is gone. So the lesson learned, I don't think, goes beyond sort of really varsity, if you want to use varsity as the sort of endpoint for it. But,
now, if you look at Suez in 1956, the airborne Anglo-French operations in Suez in 56, they're starting from square one again. It's like they've just forgotten it all. Gone.
Talking of kind of forgetting things in a sense, we had a great question from Sal at What's Going On with Shipping about were there any lessons learned in the creation of the Allied Army after the experience of the 1st Army in Africa and the 5th Army in Italy, and I'm going to add the 14th Army in Burma as well. Okay, this is particularly about airborne we're talking here, and gliders and airport, but there is a precedent for having armies of all sorts of different types of soldier within it, nationalities. So it's not like there haven't been some attempts at putting together large units of mixed personnel. Does that make sense?
Can you put the chart, the staff chart up?
Which one do you want?
And I purposely highlighted it. They're following the Schaefer model, Eisenhower's model.
Right.
Brereton's U.S., deputy British. Chief of staff is American. His deputy chief of staff is British, and it goes all the way down the senior staff. That it's alternating. There's only one senior British planner, and that's the G4, and his deputy is an American. And so that what they're learning from the meta training, I think Eisenhower takes to the European theater. It says we need to fight as one and not fight each other, even if it's not literally battle, but just over execution.
Yeah, I agree with that. Eisenhower's lessons from the Sicily invasion, where he sits out the invasion in a bunker in Malta in the Lascaris war rooms, totally disconnected with all these different commands around him, etc. And when he arrives in UK, he has a clear idea of how this should be. But actually, if you took this template and placed it over an Indian army organization in the 1800s and Anglo-Indian, you'd get this. Or a Roman legion, where it works. You have a coalition has to be organised in this way to work efficiently.
Even Wellington at Waterloo.
Yeah.
Well, an interesting
we were
question
talking
about the politics again, because that Montgomery his role changes at this time. Different things happen with 12th Army, so Andrew is asking, to what extent was the formation of the FAAA a means of limiting 21st Army Group control of British airborne forces to kind of move them under the American? Although it's not American, but it's American. Does that question ring with any of you?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's moving them out of Montgomery's direct control. If that, I'm not anything that says that's an agenda, an intent, though.
Isn't Montgomery? I mean, Browning, Montgomery's senior airborne advisor, though, right? As well as being the First Airborne Corps and the deputy of FAA. So did he really lose control? Because in comment is right. It's just
I was on a staff ride last week with the US Air Force Ramstein. And I talked about they were talking about the Allies. Anglo-US said, well, Allies, yes. There's no formal treaty. There's no definite chain of command. Either side can just say, hey, we're not doing that bit at any point and walk away. And that's the case. So it's got to be, you need the glue. You need your Eisenhower and Beadle Smith and people like that, and Tedder, people who are diplomatic and can think to do it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we have been discussing on the channel a lot in the last few weeks when we talked about Brittany and Dragoon and all the things is that July, August, September is the real transition period of the Americans absolutely taking the front seat for the rest of the war because of the sheer volume of people they've got in theatre. Early, even on D-Day, it was slightly more British and Canadian troops on D-Day than it was American, but that shift just starts occurring. And by August, because of manpower shortages, if nothing else, the American role is becoming bigger and bigger. So even if the First Allied Airborne Army hadn't been created, you're going to see that kind of shift happening. Just however the organization is going, we're going to see that happening anyway, aren't we?
Yeah, I think you could argue, or I would argue, that Anzio is the point for that. This discussion about LSTs and LCTs is the point where Roosevelt pats Churchill on the shoulder and says, "Okay, that's it now. We're in charge." The reality.
So we've kind of discussed its creation. We've talked a little about the personalities involved. We've got to get to the elephant in the room, which is how this affects Operation Market Garden. All the ones that James wrote about that didn't happen. Well, there is one is going to happen, and it has been 80 years of discussion since then about who was at fault, what went wrong, and one of you I think said it earlier, that had Market Garden worked perfectly, there wouldn't have been the need to go back and say, well, it was your 38 guiders used for this and that was all wrong, and that, we're only examining it because it went wrong to that extent. So James, let's start with you. What were the direct impacts of the creation of the army and Brereton's appointment that affected Market Garden?
Well, I mean, the thing that came out strongest to me was the relationship issue with Browning and Brereton, where, because of issues around Linnet 2, where Brereton wants to switch Linnet from one side of Belgium to the other at 36 hours notice. Browning offers his resignation. The mistake he makes is that he also says that Gavin and Taylor would resign as well, which was never going to happen. Browning clearly misunderstood the small p politics there completely. Browning later withdraws his resignation because he realises that it's actually going to be accepted. But, of course, you can only threaten to resign once. So you've got this issue where he probably wanted his boss's job in Brereton. He's threatened to resign. They've kind of come to a bit of an uneasy compromise. So it always strikes me that you've got two guys here that are meant to be leading stroke planning this huge operation. And about 2 weeks before, they'd essentially had an argument that got to the point of one of them threatening to resign. So, obviously we don't know much about how that actually affected things, but it wouldn't be human nature if it didn't, would it? It's not an ideal way to go into an operation like this, really, is it?
Which, great time to bring Jeff in now, because you were saying before we went live that Brereton remains a bit of a man of mystery. I mean, I'm working on 8th Corps in Normandy, and Middleton, to some extent, is a bit of a man of mystery because he didn't keep much of an archive, whereas some of the people we're talking about kept loads and loads of archives. Montgomery, I'm kind of looking in his direction, although Bradley isn't coming up tonight. 2 versions of his memoirs. So Brereton we can't really always get an angle on his motivations, his personal feelings about things, because we tend to understand him through the viewpoint of others. Is that kind of correct, Jeff?
Yeah, he in 46, he published something called Brereton's Diaries, which is a day-to-day or close to day-to-day of his job. But it's really selective, and of course it shines himself in the best light, like most of those post-war memoirs do. And I think the way that you get to understand him as the FAA commander is Floyd Parks, who was his chief of staff, kept a daily diary, and a guy named Ralph Steerley, who was the G3. His paperwork is with the with the Air Force Archives, and so you can kind of get they kept some documents about the decision-making process at the FAA. And so you get a glimpse of them, but he does not keep Brereton himself doesn't keep an archive. There's no paperwork collection for him. And I think he was probably purposeful. He likes to have a good PR, doesn't want bad PR. And I don't think it was just on his mind to keep a full story. So you get through, I think, at least for me, to get to Brereton, you have to go through his staff and then sort of the decisions that the FAA, in this case, make in support of operations.
I mean, I suppose we'll bring Mike in a second. If Brereton at the end of Market Garden, when all the kind of the fallout is happening and the press are taking hold of things, and if Brereton's thinking, well, that's good, the press corps aren't outside my window demanding my point on that, he's never going to kind of poke that after that. He's kind of got away with one and lets other people kind of walk in and take all that flack. I've made that pun again, but there are other people who are taking that criticism on board. So he's just kind of, slowly the Homer Simpson backing into the hedge meme, Brereton after Market Garden, kind of not my circus, not my monkeys. But Mike, we'll bring you in. How does the First Allied Airborne Army affect the Market Garden planning? And I will count on my fingers how many times you use the word gliders. I'll keep a running score.
I'll try not to. But I think overall it has a positive effect in respect that we tend to think of just the three airborne divisions being delivered into battle and off they go. But to get them there, to have the reconnaissance, to suppress the flak, to have the air plan, to think three-dimensionally about how the route in, the height out, all of that planning, coordination, that would not have happened without First Allied Airborne Army and its links to the troop transport commands. It's just the scale and complexity of this operation. Even now would be a tough challenge. So to do what they did is phenomenal, and it couldn't have happened without the Allied Airborne Army. But it should have stopped there. To try and become an operational force, for Browning to take that headquarters into the field, to what end? With the comms that were available at the time, that's where it goes wrong. We can talk about the South Staffordshire gliders and all of that, but But what I found when I was doing my Arnhem research for the GPR book was A Squadron and the GPR were flew that half of the lift, the headquarters. The other half flew into Arnhem carrying bayonets, carrying infantry troops, etc. And they were the ones that landed at Arnhem were told it would be quite fine for them to pick up their kit afterwards and march from Arnhem back down the corridor to Nijmegen to join Browning's headquarters, to join the defence force around that headquarters. That's how benign they thought things would be in First Allied Airborne headquarters at the time. I think it overall it's a positive thing because you have to have that air component. I mean, I've worked in air headquarters as a Brown job, and they speak different languages, completely different languages, and you need translators. And I don't think it would have worked. This operation particularly would not have worked without First Allied Airborne Army, or would not have worked as well.
Okay, I wasn't expecting you to kind of go that way, James.
Yeah, I guess the other thing one of the things I noticed is once FAA come into it, the air support plan gets really scaled up. So some of the earlier operations I looked at for Wild Oats, for example, or the ones in Brittany, there just isn't an air support plan that accompanies it, or if it is, it's extremely well buried. For Linnet, Comet, Market Garden, the air support plan around fighter bombers, around preliminary bombing is absolutely beautiful. The planning and the laying on of it is fantastic. And without, as Mike said, without the Allied Airborne Army and without some of these air generals and air commanders with their bringing their experience to the table, you simply wouldn't have had that. So that, I think that is a big impact where that side of things really scales up. We can debate how effective it is on the ground, but in terms of the plan, excellent.
To me, that's the credit to Brereton when his G3, their air guys, and the plan's G5 are airborne guys. And so bringing in the combining the two as the outline plan, I think that's a credit to Brereton. I don't whether he was given those staff or some of them he selected. 9th Troop Carrier Command Williams has been doing this since November 1942, and so he's got a staff, a crackerjack staff, and able to pull together that outline plan and make those connections, like you were talking about, James, to the tactical air piece and injecting it into the plan.
Can I chuck in one thing, Woody, that I think it does go wrong? Is after the first drops, the second and third lifts, that's where First Allied Airborne Army falls down, the resupplies and the follow-on drops. Certainly the third glider lift, when you've got gliders being scrapped together from all over the place with no fighter escort being sent across. And I think we talked before we came on air about my view about on D-Day itself on Market Garden, where everyone's in the air, including Brereton, who's in a 381st Bomb Group B-17, cruising up and down, being a battlefield tourist. Browning's on his way in. Everybody, there is nobody with a real coherent control or grip of the operation, and that's where the Allied Airborne Army falls down. Yeah,
it kind of hasn't got its Ramsey in a sense of coordinating dynamo from Dover. It hasn't got that overseeing thing. So
I'm sure the staff are there, but there's no coherent, tangible command and control of the operation once it's launched.
That's a very good point. So, I mean, James, you talked about it when you were on about as we shift from August to September, concern of daylight, that much less daylight, because one of the things I've got written down here, and everyone's going to mention it at some point, is the no 2 lifts per day that is put down as a Brereton refused 2 lifts. Is it Brereton, or is it the constraints of the time of year giving less daylight? And we're back to that risk reward thing that you've all been talking about. Clearly, Brereton and the troop carriers don't want to lose any aircraft going in. They don't want to lose any to flak. They don't want to lose any to bad navigation. So let's kind of try and unpack that. How many lifts per day? Is there someone at fault there, or is it because it's September? How do you unpack that one?
So I didn't find anything specifically in my research about who made that order. Right. I know people have done work on that. Seb Ritchie, for example, has written about it. You do see, and I guess this is natural, and there's positives to it and negatives. You do see that the planning does become very air dominated, which I suppose is natural in a way. So all of it's similar to the stuff about flak with Linnet and Comet. You find increasingly that flak plays a bigger part in looking at routes and landing zones, stroke drop zones, which I guess is inevitable because that's that part of Europe you're operating in. You've got that heavy flak, but it becomes much more of a concern. And this thing about not wanting to lose transport aircraft. And I think there is a debate about if the airborne operation is meant to have a certain element of risk, what element of risk do you accept in transport aircraft? Yep. I think that's something that was never really reconciled. So I think that's an interesting point that I don't know if anyone's really done any research on that. I've never found anything. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but it'd be interesting to know what the other guys think.
I'd like to, Jeff, I'll just mention a couple of points from the viewers there. So Kevin Getz is saying, was Brereton heavily influenced by Williams on this decision? And JB Jones, it's Williams who stated that when Gavin requested 2 lifts, that's from the conference on 10th of September. Now, Jeff, to kind of, from your day job doing this, is that a lot of this look at the lifts and the weather and the thing is we now know what went wrong, so we're going back and trying to find the cause of went wrong. To put yourselves back in the mindset of mid-September when it's put together, how would you assess the plan without knowing what happened to it, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, Williams is an experienced troop carrier guy, worked with Brits and the Americans tentatively with Torch all the way through. And the thing about Market, it's different than Comet. It's a much larger airlift. It's a much longer distance. It's a much larger force. And, when we talk about risk, there's the ground guy's risk assessment and the air guy's risk assessment. And that's why they're supposed to sit around the table and come up with a plan. If they lose aircraft, they're not going to be able to bring the guys in on the second day if they want 2 days lift. So, and when you're thinking airplanes, you have to think, okay, what am I flying through? Right? You've got three different weather systems. You've got the UK, the Channel, and over the battlefield. And then you've got to think about the lift impacts on the power planes. So if you've got overloaded airplanes, which paratroopers are going to do and glidermen are going to do, and they're going to have to fly on those longer distances, like it's a one glider. I think Linnet and Linnet 2 were double tow, and they decide we can't do that for Market because it's too far, right? We won't be able to take the airplanes back and forth to do that. And so it's going to be a single tow. And as I think Mike had said, the first day will be suppression of flak. So we're going to go with one lift on the first day. And then it's the impact on the airplanes turning around less day of the year. There's normally an accusation towards the troop carrier that these guys don't know how to fly at night. Well, who does know how to fly at night in 1944? You could say with Bomber Command, but Bomber Command flies in a giant stream. I'm not knocking Bomber Command, but they don't fly in tight formations to bring forces into a very specific place and then get back to and repeat it again. And then while in the 9th Troop Carrier Command, they upped the number of airplanes and upped the number of air crews. They never upped the number of mechanics.
Right.
And so the support structure that sits on the base that will turn those airplanes around is not built up in the same way as the executors are doing it. So to me, when I look at the operational plan, I think Williams knows what he's doing. And who made that decision or those decisions? I've seen different reports. Is it Williams who makes those calls, or is it Brereton who makes those calls, who's also an air guy? Or is it a combination of them sitting around understanding the limitations of an airlift force and what the ground guys are asking them to do?
Let's bring Mike now, because you're the glider guy. I'm giving you full permission to say the word glider as many times as you want, because I'm putting that question to you. So, you've written about the men on the ground, and we've talked about it. We had Tan on talking about his father, who was a glider pilot regiment on the ground there, an amazing escape story. So we've covered their bravery, but the actual plan, the getting the gliders there, getting the paratroopers to there, again, sort of same as I said to Jeff there, without going into what happened to it, does the plan seem reasonable to you? Would you have kind of seen errors with it even before it goes off?
Yeah, absolutely. No, there are errors with it because it's unchanged. So, for example, let's just pick out one thing: Goss Recce Squadron, who the coup de barre we all know about, where the idea of sending armed jeeps to seize the bridge at Arnhem ahead of everybody else. You would think they would be in the first lift and they'd arrive first. But because the desired order of arrival hasn't been changed or amended and isn't allowed to be amended because everyone's got to stay where they are and take off from the same point, it isn't. So they're divisional troops, so they're quite low priority in the landing order. So tactical loading is out, and the crews for those jeeps, half of the crews are going to parachute in. They don't even travel with them in the gliders. So and that's the linchpin of Urquhart's plan to smash and grab the bridge, is for those jeeps to get there first and go, and that doesn't change. So there are lots of things like that. I mean, well, I think what is good is that by this stage of the war, towing a glider is understood and is much better than it was. And this has been. But what I would say is, when we talked about your question earlier about why is it being done this way, why about the lifts and the number of transport aircraft. Every army is always ready to fight its last battle. And in this case, the last battle is the night drop into Normandy, and the flak damage and the losses and etc., aircrew losses and battle shock and all those other things. They're the biggest factor, and that shapes the thinking. So I think Williams is right, but I would say to you, Woody, is in the end, it's Brereton who signs it off. He's commander of First Allied Airborne Army. He's the one who says, whatever Williams says, whatever Browning says, credit to Brereton. He says, because Hollingsworth, RAF 38 group, say, yeah, we can do 2 lifts, maybe even 3 in a day to, and we'll get you to Arnhem. But that doesn't do the bottom to top. So, and that's where the ground and the air element come in, because bottom to top is 101st first because they take so many losses and they need second armies as artillery support. It's It's all of those things, and getting them on the ground first, and the transport. And we mentioned Second Allied Tactical Air Force, and the real danger of fratricide.
Yeah.
That many aircraft in the sky at one time, in different directions, flying around. Aircraft recognition being the way it is. So to do it the way they did, I keep coming back to it. That's down to First Allied Airborne Army. That's a plus side of it. There are lots of negatives, I think. But who owned the decision to say, no, you can't change the airfields you leave from, you can't leave the aircraft, the order you leave in, you can't mess around with that. That's what really shapes Market Garden.
We've got comments in about the order in which things are landing, and of course, in an ideal world, you'd have everything land first, but you can't. You've got to select some kind of order, and there's arguments for all sorts of aspects. You want some heavy stuff to defend drop zones. You want the jeeps to move to the bridge, but you want plenty of paratroopers to do their stuff. You want it all there. You want your whole team there at the beginning, and of course, that was never going to happen because they're still bringing people in two days later. But James, as we kind of moving, we've done an hour and 10 minutes. It's flown by. Another pun there. In this 80-year unraveling the Gordian knot that is Market Garden, we're never going to completely just say, okay, we've drawn a line out of this. We know everything went wrong. We know everything went right. Here's the list of villains and heroes. It's always going to remain this complex discussion down to interpretation, isn't it?
That's probably why we're sat here talking about it now, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I'm a civvy. I come at this because my granddad was an Arnhem veteran, and I've been reading and studying about Arnhem for 30 plus years. I change my opinion on so many of these things every day, depending on what I last read. Not in a facile sort of way, but trying to make sense of this is really, really hard, and that's why it is really important that we keep studying it, because there are sources out there that people haven't looked at. It's quite hard to find them, but they are there. Or there's aspects of the story that we haven't looked at. There's always new things that we can look at, particularly now hardly any of the participants are around. We need to do it in a different way, obviously.
Well, that's a good point to put. So what way should we be studying? We've kind of unraveled some of this stuff. They've talked about it, but where are we in this studying it? What have we got to put to bed, Mike? What do you think the future is for discussions about Market Garden, and particularly with relation to Brereton and First Allied Airborne Army?
I think we need to. I think it's really good that we're giving Brereton some scrutiny, because he is one of the decision makers that you sort of sat in the grey in the background as a grey man. I think that's important to get him in to think about more about what decisions he made and why he made them, and also to be outside Market Garden. We touched on it briefly. V2s landing in Chiswick, and why the Netherlands has to be the strategic and operational impact, and what was the ultimate aim of that? Was this great tank battle in the Ruhr Valley, breaking through? Why were they doing what? Why did Eisenhower say, "Okay, Monty, this is a good idea, bold and audacious"? So why not? Why did he do that? Because at the time it probably was a good idea. The time of Comet, liberating Brussels, or everything seemed possible, and it's that I think the biggest thing we do wrong is we apply our 21st century values and knowledge to the situation. How long does it take to transmit a set of orders to all those airfields and get that acknowledgement back? 72 hours.
Yeah.
How long does it take to change and even the slightest change of that? So, if you go, and then when you get on, one question I would say is, where was 2ATAF? After
weather, right?
The biggest sword that we had to beat the Germans with in September 1944 was air power, and it wasn't there. Why?
That's a massive rabbit hole and worthy. But
just throw that in there.
No, just throw that that massive one in there. But Jeff, your reaction to that? You're the air power guy. Well, you both are.
So the air power piece, Brereton got in 9th Air Force, 8th Air Force, ADGB, and the 2nd TAF for the initial operation. And then once they're on the ground, 9th Air Force has another job, 8th Air Force has another job. Yeah. They are in the 21st Army Group sector. That's 2nd TAF. And it's their job to do it. Now, 2nd TAF has their own issues from weather, from airfield locations, range of aircraft, and all that kind of stuff. Coordination between air and ground. So there's all that kind of thing happening. So I agree the airpiece is missing after the first couple of days, but it's really, that's when it devolves back to 21st Army Group versus Schaeff.
Yeah.
And it's a 21st Army Group fight, so it's a second TAF fight. It's not an 8th and 9th Air Force fight.
So you could argue that Brereton and First Allied Airborne Army headquarters could have done more with 2 TAF to get them in the battle.
Except for where do you draw the line? Because, the mandate, I think, for FAAA was once the forces are on the ground and they are connected to the ground forces, that their responsibility for the operation ends. And the only responsibility they had was to rehabilitate airborne forces when they're pulled out.
So why do you get these Air Force guys on the show, mate? This is the kind of stuff they come out with all the time. They never give you.
Well, we need to look at the Navy here, putting their oar in. Another pun there. Slip that one in there. But
so just one thing on the FAA, who suffers at the FAA because of Market Garden? I would argue that it's Browning. Who leaves FAA? Browning is sent to India, right? And then Gale takes as deputy commander and rolls into varsity. And in January, Browning is done with the First Allied Airborne Army. He requests Arnold to be reassigned. He says, take the airpiece out of this FAA, let it be an airborne thing, and send me please to an air unit. And Arnold basically doesn't respond, and so he stays on in command of FAA.
Yeah, well, that's a good thing to just touch on there, is that Browning ending up becoming the fall guy. And, you can't, we've avoided talking about A Bridge Too Far, the movie, but, it does hang heavy over all of this because of the portrayal there, which is for most people a kind of a big frame of reference for Browning. Brereton is not a character in the movie. Montgomery is not a character in the movie. And so, Urquhart, and I watched the movie, I had the movie on while I was doing other things and stuff, and Urquhart kind of, unleashes his wrath and his unbelief against Browning, and Browning ends up being the fall guy. Roger, was it? I think it was Roger Cirillo, was Paul Otofsky, but talking about blame being shared around for the Falaise pocket. Are we in agreement that there clearly have been errors made with Market Garden, and there is blame to put in certain areas, but it should be spread around rather along several people? It's not ever going to be the question of blaming it all on one person. Are we in agreement about that? Yeah. Sort of. So you're nodding your head there, Jeff. So does Browning become a fall guy unfairly, or would you say he deserves a lot of the flack he gets?
I think I think he fairly received some blame. Does he have to be the only guy to get the blame? No. But as Mike was saying, why was First Airborne Corps in this fight? What was the purpose of bringing a Corps headquarters when 101st already belonged to 30 Corps, and then as soon as 30 Corps got up there, they were going to get control of the division? So I don't understand the role of Browning in this fight. And then he was also in a tough place, right? First, as I said, Corps commander, deputy commander, politics of post-war airborne. He's never been in combat in the Second World War as an airborne guy, right? And again, if the war's over by Christmas, what do you Ridgway does the same thing. He's done with being an airborne corps commander in March, and he wants to be a ground corps commander because he's looking at his post-war career, So Browning, to me, gets some of the blame. I think the easy button used to be to blame the air guys. I'm a ground and I'm an air guy, and I think there's some blame to go to both sides.
Yeah, I agree.
So let's kind of begin to round things up with kind of closing thoughts. Really, I think it's been a fantastic conversation. As predicted, we haven't drawn the line under everything. We've left lots of things open for further discussion, which is great. But the point of this was to talk about Brereton and the First Allied Airborne Army, which we've done. But any kind of final remarks, James, that you think we should have discussed or worth elaborating on in the future?
Oh well, I mean, how to sum this up in a few minutes? I think it shows how years ago people probably started to think we've done everything we can on Market Garden, and actually. I think in some respects, actually, it's even more of an opportunity for us to look at some of these things and look at people that haven't been studied, look at aspects of it that haven't been worked on, and they might not be revelatory in their own, but when you add together all these different pieces to the jigsaw, there is still a lot that we can look at. And even we've talked about things that were written about years ago, but because they've been looked at more recently, they enable us to look a little bit differently at them. So I think it does really show the benefit of studying some of this stuff and looking for different angles and different sources.
And Mike, you're off on another battlefield tour in a couple of days' time, and you've just come back from one now. In my battlefield guide days and in doing this, is that people get pretty entrenched in their opinions, and the Monty guys love Monty, and the Patton guys love Patton, and vice versa, and MacArthur and Nimitz, all these things there. And there are certain people who've, every time we've done a Market Gardener show, they've pretty much put the same thing in there about where they think it all went wrong, and someone else said, no, it didn't go wrong there, it went wrong there. But when you're walking the battlefields with the people you do, Mike, both professional soldiers and also the amateur military historians, are people open to kind of new discussions about Market Garden if you present things in the right way, or do you have to kind of overcome that hurdle of entrenched ideas?
I do a slowly approach. I mean, great example, is Arnhem and the airborne mafia around that, or perhaps the Anzac. Everyone has their own very firm views about it, and it's just to keep presenting the facts. And also the other thing that I think is important is something we've not really got into in the depth on here on Brereton is the human angle, their background, their personality. Because the thing with Brereton is his personal life, and again he stayed in the shadows. Even on the discussion of Brereton, he still managed to stay in the shadows. So I think looking at some of these people and what makes them tick and how they interoperate together is important. And Montgomery's a great example of that. Well, they all are. Somebody who raves about Patton or Rommel, I'd say, well, what about this? And there's always an alternative view. And I think to get a 360 view is important. And, it's only very recently, really, we've really got the German version of events on in the last 10 or 15 years sort of thing. So we're only really starting to get a full picture now of and that long may it continue. And the air aspects of it are, there's lots more to find out, to learn, I think.
So same question to you, Jeff, really. The people you take out, who we discuss this with, entrenched views, are people open to ideas? Is the military more open to new ideas than kind of civilians? What's your take on the kind of the understanding?
I've never taken civilians on a staff writer tour. I've only done military units. And there are people who have a certain idea, but like I think Mike was saying, you start out small and you build up. So I go to Arnhem, I follow the reconnaissance Jeep squadron, but I provide the details for the story without necessarily getting to the conclusion, such as why did they jump versus ride with the Jeeps and their gliders and the airborne. And I talk airborne sort of ego. And so I find people changing their attitude if you present them with a widespread of information and you let them draw conclusions that are, I get it, part guided from the information that I'm providing, but I try to make it balanced. And so I think that there are chances for ideas to change. And you get away from, I show the film Bridge Too Far as a beginning, and then we revisit it throughout. And then lots of books are ground oriented. I think as all of us have said, you need a bigger picture. You need a joint combined picture to understand the battle. And I think that's being added now, or I hope that it's being added now. And so it's like, it's not just the Grand 82nd or the 101st doing something. How did they get there? Well, the anti-tank gun that's sitting there was brought in by a glider, right? And so and so you broaden the picture. And so on staff rides, I think I walk away from the unit with a better understanding, lessons learned, which is really about command and control, flow of forces. Like when we were talking about airlift, 101st decided not to bring artillery in first, but the 82nd did when they made the decision on what the forces flowing into the battle space. And those commanders made those decisions on that risk assessment, where they were in relation to 30 Corps, et cetera, like that. Those don't normally get brought into the discussion. I think they get brought in more as we move forward.
I mean, I'm with you, James, and all of you in that, when I had John McManus on Friday, I rather unsubtly said there's a shit lot of stuff happening in August, September 1944, just in the ETO, not counting what's happening around the rest of the world. Look at Patton's Third Army that spreads out from Brittany to near Metz. That's the entire east-west France. That's just how to get supplies to the Third Army. And so looking at this, without looking at it and the other things, as Indy Nidell says on his channel, nothing happens in a vacuum. And I think what we've tried to do here is kind of place this in a context of what is happening in Brittany and the south of France, and with the 8th and 9th Air Forces and Bomber Command doing what they're as part of the Strategic Air Campaign. It's all these things are happening. And Mike, you particularly said it earlier, this victory fever that's in the air, that the Germans are broken, but also this terror fear of the V weapons that is happening at the same time. On the one hand, we think we're going to win the war, but at the same time, London has had the worst casualties it's had for several years. So to understand Market Garden, you've got to look at all of those things, all the situation at the time, what the public are thinking, what the commanders are thinking, what the people on the ground are thinking, and even then, it just makes it a complicated operation to study, but in some ways that's what's not fun about it, in the sense that lots of people died and were captured and what have you, but the academic process can be rewarding. So, well, folks, it's been fantastic talking to you. I'll have you all back on again at some point in the future, I'm sure. James, good luck with the books. Mike, with your books as well. And Jeff, we'll have you back.
Thanks,
Thank you for the slides you've given us. And it's been great. So I've only got one show definitely scheduled for the coming week, 2 shows scheduled, but I'm still working on a couple of extra ones. I might do an Ask Me Anything either tomorrow or Tuesday, but I'm working on a few things. And I'm off for a week when I'm doing my battlefield tour in Normandy. Then we've got more stuff. We've got Aachen coming up after then, and we go look at the Pacific again, and Hergen Forest, all sorts of things coming up. So click like and subscribe, buy my guest books, check out their websites, take their tours, etc., etc., etc. So guys, it's been a rather interesting Sunday afternoon. I'm feeling both. I've learned a lot, but also lots more questions that have now come into my head. So thanks for that, and thanks for that in a both positive and negative way.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Nice to meet you all.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers, then. Thanks, everybody. See you next time. Bye.